Hello and welcome to our Case for a Creator book study. I'm Kevin J.N. Hughes, your host, and today we're going to start looking at the so-called images or icons of evolution. So I'm going to start. Just to get this out of the way, this chapter is going to mostly be focused on the images of evolution themselves. And then next week, we're actually going to start in earnest dealing with these things and exposing them. So this week is mostly just explaining them, and I'm going to provide some initial remarks on each. And then next week is when we really provide answers from the realm of science to deal with these objections. Before I get too far into it, though, I do want to remind everybody to please check out the links in the description below if you want to support this show and everything that's happening at Freed Indeed Ministries. Please do follow the links in the description, and you'll be able to support us there. I also highly recommend supporting the Archdiocese of Alaska to help them to have schools in native languages and parish priests to pastor the rural communities there. So I definitely highly recommend participating in that and giving your support to that if you're able. So last week, we introduced this series by discussing whether science and faith are really enemies, if they really have to be enemies. And we kind of introduced that thought and examined the question. You know, we often see science and faith being pitted against one another. And has some of the comments that I got back from that video, some of the messages people sent, indicate a big part of that is because people either misunderstand what faith is and assume that faith has to be a blind faith that doesn't take any evidence into account, in which case they're misunderstanding what faith is actually, what the purpose of faith is, or they have a misunderstanding of the science. They think science points to things that go against the doctrines of faith when perhaps it doesn't. Or they have a misunderstanding of things in Christianity, such that they think science is going against Christianity when in fact Christianity per se doesn't teach what they are asserting in the first place. So those are some of the things that happen, but even with all of that said, sometimes things that some people within the scientific community claim to be the case do go against the faith, do go against what the faith actually does in fact teach. And when that happens, we have to come to a conclusion. We have to make a decision, and it's good for us to be able to examine these issues honestly and intelligently. So this week, we're going to start to do that by examining the so-called icons of evolution. Now, in order to understand the so-called icons of evolution, I'm first going to take this, just as Lee Strobel does in this book. He first introduces all of the icons of evolution in chapter 2, and then chapter 3 is a fairly long chapter where he interviews a scientist, I should say, who really sets to the task of demonstrating the falsehood of these so-called icons of evolution. So we're going to organize the book club in much the same way, but I wanted to say all of that up front because I think it's really important for us to actually have these icons of evolution understood first and foremost, and then in understanding them accurately, we can understand how to deal with the objections they present and whether or not those objections even need to be dealt with as well. So we're going to explore common images used to teach evolution, and then we're going to explore some reasons why these things may be misleading or debunked. And then, like I said, next week, we're going to get a lot more detailed. We're going to start next week. I think chapter 3 is probably going to have to be broken up into 2 or maybe even 3 parts, probably 2 parts. But nevertheless, let's get into it. So on page 19, Lee Strobel presents 2 quotes that from people who study the sciences and from people within the scientific community. And these 2 quotes are very telling of the debate that we're entering in on. So first we have, quote, "The problem is to get people to reject irrational and supernatural explanations for the world, the demons that exist only in their imaginations, and to accept the social and intellectual apparatus, science, as the only begetter of truth." That's from Harvard geneticist Richard Lewontin. Meanwhile, another quote, quote, "Science has become identified with a philosophy known as materialism or scientific materialism. This philosophy insists that nature is all there is, or at least the only thing about which we can have any real knowledge. It follows that nature had to do its own creating, and the means of creation must not have included any role for God." That's a quote from evolution critic Philip E. Johnson. So this quote, these 2 quotes, better than probably any other 2 quotes that Strobel could have chosen, accurately portrays the 2 sides of the debate in which we're entering in. That is, whether philosophical materialism is an acceptable answer, whether that accurately and completely explains everything that we do in fact see and encounter in the world, or whether there is, and by extension, that would mean that we should reject the existence of anything that cannot be explained scientifically, which would include but not limit the existence of God. However, on the other hand, you might ask whether materialism falls short as an explanatory force for all things, and if that's the case, then we have no reason to reject the existence of God. And so it's interesting that this modernist assumption that scientific knowledge is the only kind of true knowledge is at the heart of a lot of other debates as well. For a number of years, I had a friend who would come visit me at the bookstore and would kind of debate with me. And despite the fact that he called himself a Christian, he had adopted this principle that scientific knowledge was really the only kind of true knowledge, and it led him down a path of sort of nominalism and what we might say is, I guess, ecumenism, but also just relativism, basically, with regard to the metaphysical. He just had this very relativist position that it doesn't matter what people believe because in regards to religion or anything, because science is the only thing that gives us true knowledge. And of course, that excluded things he believed very strongly. For example, caring for the poor and these things, which I also believe in. But of course, somehow those beliefs were excluded from beliefs that were just adiaphora, things that don't matter. But things like the Trinity or the Incarnation or anything that really is a deeply held Christian belief, he didn't have time for or couldn't care less about. So Strobel had accepted this modernist paradigm. In fact, I made reference last week in my introduction to the series to the fact that Strobel and I both had accepted this paradigm. And Lee Strobel goes down in this chapter. Lee Strobel begins by explaining the reason why he fell into atheism. One reason was because he was just a very curious young man, and the particular church he belonged to did not really approve of asking questions. And I think that's a very problematic approach. I touched on that last week, that we need to be able to give people a good space to ask good questions. But also, he had accepted this modernist paradigm that science and faith were kind of opposed to one another, and that scientific knowledge was the only kind of knowledge that you could really have. And this led him down a path of atheism because he thought that science had essentially disproved religion, had, as he says, put God out of the job. Now, it's interesting that Lee Strobel and I both had come to the conclusion that science and faith were opposed to one another, and we both came to this conclusion in our teens, or at least we both accepted this conclusion foisted upon us when we were in our teens. And in my case, it led me to lose interest in the study of science. In Strobel's case, it led him to a smug, snarky attitude against religion. So we went opposite routes, but we got there through the same misguided assumption. Strobel himself says on page 21 of this book, that's when, on that pivotal day in biology class in 1966, I began to learn about the scientific discoveries that, to borrow the words of British zoologist Richard Dawkins, made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. So the question is, does it really do that? When Richard Dawkins says that these images of evolution make it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, are these images of evolution reliable? Are these images truly capable? They make it possible to be a quote-unquote intellectually fulfilled atheist. I actually disagree with that as well, because the implications of atheism are still problematic if you're an intellectual. But for people like Dawkins who don't care to tease out the implications of what they believe, or are willing to accept the idea of living in a meaningless universe where they don't matter, and where nothing matters, if you feel like you can be intellectually fulfilled in that, then I suppose the icons of evolution that we're going to discuss could probably make you feel as Richard Dawkins clearly does. There's lots of clips of him talking about how superior he is and mocking Catholics and Christians and all these things. And there's a famous clip of him mocking the Eucharist, and encouraging other atheists to mock the Eucharist. So, he clearly feels like he's intellectually fulfilled. He clearly thinks that he's intellectually superior even to other people. But the real question then is, are these things reliable in the first place, and can they fulfill that intellectual curiosity? So we're going to look at a series of icons that are used to teach the concept of macroevolution in our culture. And then next week, we're going to begin the process of really deeply diving into these things to thoroughly refute them. So the first of these is the Stanley Miller experiment. At the University of Chicago in 1953, Stanley Miller did an experiment in which he claimed to reproduce the atmosphere of the early Earth and then introduce sort of a simulated kind of lightning strike, and it produced these essentially amino acids. And so he proved, according to his claim, that it was possible for life, or the building blocks of life, to have emerged spontaneously in nature without the presence of an intelligent designer. Lee Strobel writes, "The moment I learned of Miller's success, my mind flashed to the logical implication. If the origin of life can be explained solely through natural processes, then God was out of the job. After all, there was no need for a deity if living organisms could emerge by themselves out of primordial soup and then develop naturally over the eons into more and more complex creatures, a scenario that was illustrated by the next icon of evolution." Before we go on to the next icon of evolution, though, I want to note a couple of problems with Stanley Miller's experiment. First off, Miller's experiment is incorrect because he got the composition of the early Earth's atmosphere totally wrong. Science has progressed a lot in the years since Miller, and we now know that if indeed there was such an early Earth that Miller hypothesized, then its atmosphere looked totally different than what he presented. Now, since he got that composition wrong, his experiment therefore does not reflect reality. The Stanley Miller experiment, by the way, was retried with the early Earth atmospheric conditions that scientists have since discovered and uncovered. And what was produced was cyanide, not the proteins that were meant, or that Stanley Miller believed he had created. So what you get if you repeat the Stanley Miller experiment with a more accurate perception, you get cyanide, you get poison. You do not get the building blocks of life. You get something hostile to life. And this is very important because modern science textbooks that are still used to this day in high school classrooms and even college classrooms present the Stanley Miller experiment as if it was successful and as if it demonstrates somehow that that the basic building blocks of life could have emerged spontaneously in the early Earth. Now, they will usually include some footnote or parenthetical statement somewhere in the text that explains that, as a matter of fact, Stanley Miller was mistaken, but they will misleadingly say, but when this experiment was repeated, it still produced certain proteins. They leave out the fact that the certain proteins are cyanide, but they'll say that. So my point is that this is a very misleading approach. It's very misleading to claim that the Stanley Miller experiment actually demonstrated that the early Earth could have produced organic material, could have produced living organisms without the intervention of a creator. Moreover, I have two other problems. That's just one problem. That's the scientific problem. But I have two other problems philosophically. One, even if his experiment did work, which it didn't, but even if it had, it wouldn't have produced life. It would have produced certain proteins that form the building blocks for life. But if I took a living organism and poked it and had all of its a little single-celled organism, and I poked its membrane so that all of those same building blocks spilled out, I could never put Humpty Dumpty together again. It would be dead, and it would never come back together, no matter how I stirred the saline solution. So the idea that having some basic proteins would eventually spontaneously turn into life is absolutely absurd. But there's also another problem, and that's the fact that Stanley Miller himself is required to make the experiment work. So, in other words, you need an intelligent designer in order to make these conditions even happen. And so that does not prove that these things would happen without an intelligent designer. It only proves that an intelligent designer can bring these things about. But since Stanley Miller's experiment is actually an utter failure that's based on false presuppositions, even scientifically, it doesn't really matter because the experiment doesn't produce the results claimed, and it's misleading to say that it does. So the second image of evolution is Darwin's tree of life. Darwin's tree of life is a metaphor that is used to describe all living organisms coming from one single common ancestor and then branching out. So Lee Strobel says of the tree of life, as a recent textbook explains, Darwinism teaches that all life forms are related through descent from some kind of unknown prototype that lived in the remote past. It seemed obvious to me that there's such a phenomenon as microevolution or variations within different kinds of animals. I could see this illustrated in my own neighborhood, where we had dozens of different varieties of dogs. But I was captivated by the more ambitious claim of macroevolution, that natural selection acting on random variations can explain how primitive cells morphed over long periods of time into every species of creature, including human beings. In other words, fish were transformed into amphibians, amphibians into reptiles, reptiles into birds and mammals, with humans having the same ancestors as apes. Now, I'm going to be completely honest and just say that this particular icon of evolution and the particular claims being expressed through this icon of evolution have always been manifestly absurd to me. It just seems manifestly absurd to me that it's even possible for all organisms to share a single common ancestor. It's manifestly absurd to me that humans and apes have a common ancestor. It's manifestly absurd to me that lions and puppies have a common ancestor. Manifestly absurd to me that kangaroos and tigers and rhinoceroses all have a common ancestor if you just go back far enough. This is all something that is just totally absurd to the mind. And so I have never found this to be a convincing claim, but many, many people do find it convincing, and they find Darwin's tree of life to be a very convincing sort of diagram for such a thing. So, first of all, there's actually even more problems with this than with the Stanley Miller experiment. So first off, the fossil record tells a very different story. The fossil record does not tell a story of a tree of life, but rather even many biologists today are saying that it's not so much a tree of life as a field full of grass where all of the different creatures sort of spring up in different places simultaneously. And we see this in, for example, the quote-unquote biological Big Bang, the Cambrian explosion as it's often called. The biological Big Bang is a leap forward in which millions of different kinds of animals just sort of appear on the scene with no common ancestor to speak of. And this is actually the premise of Stephen Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt, where Stephen Meyer explores the fact that Charles Darwin himself said that even in his own day, the fossil record did not bear out his theory, and certainly did not bear out his tree of life. But he said that he hoped that the fossil record would eventually fill in those gaps. But even Darwin himself said that if the fossil record did not in fact fill out those gaps, then this was a big problem for his theory. And in modern times, the fossil record has done the opposite of filling in those gaps. The fossil record has only created more gaps, and the fossil record has only eliminated more and more the possibility of Darwin's tree of life. So when atheists mock us for believing in the so-called God of the gaps, it's actually their theory that has holes in it and that requires me to ignore large gaps of information that simply invalidates the theory. So now we get to what I find to be actually the least compelling of these arguments, and that's Haeckel's embryos. So in this instance, Haeckel's embryos, this, by the way, has been something that's been taken up by the pro-abortion movement. So the pro-abortion movement uses this same diagram and tries to make the argument that, well, you can't tell the difference between a human embryo and a cow embryo at certain stages of life, so therefore human beings at the moment of conception don't matter and can just be unalived with reckless abandon, which is completely absurd. But the thing is, they're borrowing from the evolutionist paradigm. They're borrowing from the evolutionist argumentation and from Haeckel's embryos. So let's talk about how this even came about. German biologist Ernst Haeckel, whose sketches of embryos could be found in virtually every evolution book I studied, provided even more evidence for all of life having the same ancient progenitor by juxtaposing drawings of an embryonic fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, hog, calf, rabbit, and human. Haeckel geographically established that they all appeared strikingly similar in their earliest stages of development. It was only later that they became distinctly different. So, first off, the biggest problem I have is that Haeckel's point is literally based on deception. So, Haeckel is not... These are drawings. They're not photographs. They're not anything. They're drawings. And his drawings, in these drawings, he intentionally accentuates certain features that make different creatures look more similar than they actually do. If you put photographs side by side of various animals at the stages of development where Haeckel is saying that they look exactly the same, you'll find that they don't actually look as similar as he's claiming. So this is perhaps the most misleading of all of the arguments, because Haeckel himself was actually being misleading intentionally. But second, even if this was true, a person looking different from another person does not make them any less human or any less valuable. So just because infants in the womb at certain stages of development don't look like me yet doesn't mean that they have any less value than I do as human beings. Stages of development don't make us less human. Shahir says hi. Hi, Shahir. So now let's take a look. Well, I guess I should. We're going to, in chapter 3, we're going to go through a lot more refutation of Haeckel's embryos. But my point here is just to say that I don't even really see this as an argument for anything, because not only is it misleading, but even if it were true, it's just sort of a trite truth. Okay, so what? Different people look different and look different at different points in time in their life. And none of that has any bearing on anything, whatever. So now we're going to look at the Archaeopteryx. The Archaeopteryx is supposed to be a missing link between reptiles and birds. On page 24 of this book, he discusses the Archaeopteryx. He says, one look at a picture of that fossil chased away any misgivings about whether the fossil record supported Darwin's theory. Here was a half bird, half reptile. I needed look no further to believe that paleontology backed up Darwin. Indeed, the Archaeopteryx, having been discovered in Germany immediately after The Origin of Species was published, quote, helped enormously in the establishment of the credibility of Darwinism and to discredit the skeptics, end quote. That's a quote from a Darwinist named Johnson. So there's several problems with this one. One of which is that the Archaeopteryx wasn't actually a reptile at all. And I have a link in the description below to a great article by Dr. Gabriella Haynes. And Dr. Gabriella Haynes demonstrates in that article that the Archaeopteryx was a bird. She discusses the fact that it was a bird. It had some features that were somewhat similar to reptiles, sure, but there are birds with different features, and it doesn't make them reptile. This was not an example of a reptile with wings, is what I'm getting at. So, but we're going to discuss that a lot more in chapter 3. But I just want to initially make that point and offer you further reading in the link in the description below. Now, one other thing that we should note, though, is that some people don't believe that there's even a contradiction here. For example, Lee Strobel notes on page 25, Nobel-winning biologist Christine Dedouet insisted there is, quote, no sense in which atheism is enforced or established by science, end quote. Well, biology professor Kenneth R. Miller of Brown University declared that evolution is, quote, not anti-God, end quote. Philosopher Michael Ruse himself, an ardent naturalist, answered the question, can a Darwinist be a Christian, by declaring, quote, absolutely. In his view, no sound argument has been mounted showing that Darwinism implies atheism. Biologist Jean Pond, who formerly taught at Whitworth College, proudly described herself as a scientist, evolutionist, a great admirer of Charles Darwin, and a Christian. She elaborated by saying, quote, believing that evolution occurred, that humans and all other living things are related as part of creation's giant family tree, and that it is possible that the first cell arose by the natural process of chemical evolution, neither requires nor promotes an atheist worldview. So I see that we've got some people in the chat. If you have a question that you'd like addressed on the show, you can ask it. But this is a class, not a book club, and I'm not going to engage in a lot of side conversation. So if you have a question related to the topic at hand, then I am willing to address it. A question related to the topic. So I have videos on your question. I see here that Shahir has a question. Is Jesus the God? I have videos on the Trinity already, videos where I demonstrate the Trinity. I would encourage you to go watch those. That's not the topic at hand here. So go watch those videos. If you have objections to them, post those objections in the comments, and I'll either do a future video refuting your objections, or I'll discuss it with you in the comment section of those videos. I don't have time to have a lot of back and forth, and I want to stay on topic here. So a great example of a ministry that is really focused on this idea that you can be that you can believe in macroevolution and all of the conclusions of modern Darwinism and also be a Christian. One of the sort of leading groups that teaches this is BioLogos, or I shouldn't say leading, but one of the most popular level groups discussing this is called BioLogos. And there are many people who believe that macroevolution and Christianity are compatible beliefs. Lee Strobel and I, however, are both not convinced. And, you know, I think Lee Strobel does a really good job of, and the scientists he interviews do a good job in this book of refuting the ideas of macroevolution. But one thing that I will say for my own part is that it seems very clear to me that the doctrine of macroevolution is fundamentally incompatible with Christianity and with Christian truth claims. I don't actually believe that it inclines one towards atheism. I believe that it would incline one more towards a kind of philosophical deism to believe in evolution, because there is something deeply miraculous about the claims of evolution. There is something that is astronomically unlikely about the events evolutionists claim to happen happening. And so I think an honest evolutionist would have to admit that given how unlikely what they're claiming would happen is, there would have to be some kind of entity that had some degree of a hand in making sure that it happened the way that it did. But I don't believe that it is compatible with Christian truth claims, because Christianity teaches certain things, one of which is that human beings are created in the image of God, in the image and likeness of God. Christianity therefore goes very strongly against the idea that human beings are created in the image of brute beasts or in the likeness of brute beasts. We are made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore to say that we evolved from some other kind of creature is to blaspheme. I would also say that particularly a theologian like Jimmy Akin, who has the has said on multiple occasions that he believes that when Genesis says that God created man out of the dust of the earth is somehow metaphorical for other animals that came before and lived and died. The problem is that Christianity's core claims go against this idea. The idea that there were ancestors of Adam and Eve is already contradicted by Scripture, but the idea that there were ancestors of Adam and Eve who died before the first sin and who obviously were not in the image of God yet is exceedingly problematic for Christianity. Another problem with the idea of trying to reconcile macroevolution and Christianity is that Christianity teaches that God created all animals, every living creature. Not that God sort of set a watch in motion and then made it go like the deist conception, but that God intimately wove together each individual kind of creature. This flies in the face of the idea that God would have simply created a single-celled organism of some sort and then had it branch out into lots of different creatures. This is simply incompatible with the God we meet in Christianity. So I would say that we ought to choose this day whom we'll serve. Are we going to serve the people who want us to believe in the Darwin's tree of life and the macroevolution, and that human beings are not unique on the earth? Or are we going to choose to believe the Christian paradigm? You can choose to believe something totally different as well, I suppose, but my point is that these two ideas simply are incompatible. And you can throw at me whatever theologians say otherwise all day long. It's clear that the teachings of the Orthodox Church, the teachings of Scripture, are not compatible with the teachings of macroevolution. So for the same reason why I can't, commune with an Arian heretic or even, a Roman Catholic for that matter, because we don't share the same faith in all respects, I also can't really see how you can reconcile philosophical and scientific Darwinism to Christianity. Now, if you disagree with me, I am happy to have that discussion. Feel free to leave a comment in the description below, in the comments below, and I'll be happy to discuss that with you. That's fine. I am happy to have charitable discussions with people, but I don't believe that the two are reconcilable. And I also don't believe that we need to believe in macroevolution in order to be scientific. And that's what the rest of this book is going to set about to prove. But on page 26, we read, "Certainly Christians would say that God is not hidden, an uninvolved deity who thoroughly conceals his activities, but rather that he has intervened in the world so much that the Bible says his qualities have been clearly seen from what has been made." Cambridge-educated philosopher of science Stephen C. Meyer, director of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, put it this way, quote, "Many evolutionary biologists admit that science cannot categorically exclude the possibility that some kind of deity still might exist, nor can they deny the possibility of a divine designer who masks his creative activity in apparently natural processes so as to escape scientific detection. Yet, for most scientific materialists, such an undetected entity hardly seems worthy of consideration. Even so, Oh, end quote. Even so, Meyer stressed that contemporary Darwinism does not envision a God-guided process of evolutionary change. He cites a famous observation by the late evolutionary biologist George Gaylord Simpson that Darwinism teaches, quote, man is the result of purposeless and natural processes that did not have him in mind, end quote. The ramifications are unmistakable. According to Meyer, to say that God guides an inherently unguided natural process, or that God designed a natural mechanism as a substitute for his design, is clearly contradictory. So these two theories, if you will, are not compatible. The theory of evolution versus the Christian claim is incompatible. Shahir Saik asks, is the theory of revolution wrong? I'm assuming you mean evolution, and that's what this whole book study is going to be about, is discussing why I believe that Christianity is true, and why I believe that Christianity is true, and also why the theory of evolution is unscientific and false. That's what this whole book is about. So if you want to learn more, I recommend subscribing to the channel so that you don't miss any of our sessions of this class. So the last image, I think, let me see, is it the last image? Maybe. So the last image is what is it's not really an icon of evolution so much as a claim, which is the claim of Darwin's universal acid, namely that Darwin's theory is like an acid that disintegrates every kind of philosophical belief, every kind of moral teaching. It turns everything relative, etc. This is what we read on page 28 and 29. I was experiencing on a personal level what philosopher Daniel Dennett observed. Darwinism is a universal acid that, quote, eats through just about every traditional concept and leaves in its wake a revolutionized worldview, end quote. So I guess it is kind of the theory of revolution, isn't it? My worldview was being revolutionized. This is what Lee Strobel has to say. My worldview was being revolutionized, all right. Yet in my youthful optimism, I was not ready to examine some of the disheartening implications of my new philosophy. I conveniently ignored the grim picture painted by British atheist Bertrand Russell, who wrote about how science had presented us with a world that was purposeless and void of meaning. He said, quote, that man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end which they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes, his fears, his loves and beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collections of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, of devotion and of all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction, that the whole temple of man's achievements must inevitably be buried. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet nearly certain, that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths can only the firm foundation of unyielding despair can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. So Bertrand Russell said that, and if you want to read books by someone who thoroughly imbibed that belief, I highly recommend H.P. Lovecraft novels. H.P. Lovecraft writes novels and has created a sort of mythology. And that is a mythology that imbibes this hopeless belief of people like Bertrand Russell. This nihilism, if you will, of Nietzsche. It imbibes this belief so that it really, truly understands the horror of a world without God and embraces it as well. So that is what Darwinism presents: a world that doesn't matter and a life void of meaning. So the seeds of atheism were sown. I want to really hammer this point home that Lee Strobel says this. So the seeds of my atheism were sown as a youngster when religious authorities seemed unwilling or unable to help me get answers to my questions about God. My disbelief flowered after discovering that Darwinism displaces the need for a deity, and my atheism came to full bloom when I studied Jesus in college and was told that no science-minded person could possibly believe what the New Testament says about him. So the irony is that, when I was growing up, I have always found that there were plenty of religious authorities in my life willing to answer my questions. I have, however, always found, or often found, that science teachers were loath to receive questions that conflicted with their worldview. For example, when I was in high school, I presented some of the very challenges found in this book to some of my science teachers and was ridiculed. And one of my science teachers told, basically the next day, told the whole class of students that I was an idiot for following a stupid book that says that a whale is a fish. To which I responded, admittedly, glibly, that I believed in a book that talked about a great fish, but he believed in a science book that said that every animal was related to a fish. So which one of us was really believing a stupid fairy tale? And his face got red, but he later admitted that my response was whimsical. But either way, the point is that whether you're in a science classroom or in a catechesis classroom, this is not how we should be catechizing. Catechism shouldn't be happening in the form of arguing with someone or telling someone off. Honest questions are a good thing, and we should encourage people to ask them. And in light of that, I have a question here. It's not related to the topic, but what language did Jesus speak? Well, we have no reason to think that Jesus was monolingual. So one of the languages he most certainly spoke was Aramaic, which is still spoken today in at least one place in Israel. But he also spoke Greek and Hebrew and potentially some Latin, although I don't know to what extent he would have spoken Latin. But he most certainly spoke Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek. So good question, I guess. It's not really relevant to this topic, though. Again, I would really encourage you. I see you have a lot of great theological questions. I would encourage you to go to the YouTube channel and watch the videos that I have on the specific topics that you're interested in, and then comment questions on those videos after you watch the video, because the video might actually answer your questions. So after you've watched those, feel free to ask questions that are on topic with those videos. This video is more specifically about the topic of evolution, so I'm trying to keep it kind of on topic. So science is a constantly moving discipline. It's not a discipline that stands still. And we're going to be exploring what the evidence that's been building shows and what it demonstrates. So on page 34, we read this. What does this new evidence show? Be prepared to be amazed, even dazzled, by the startling new narrative that science has been busy writing over the past few decades. Quote, "The old story of science is scientific materialism," wrote theoretical physicist George Stansiu and science philosopher Robert R. Gross. "It holds that only matter exists and that all things are explicable in terms of matter alone," end quote. But they say in recent years, quote, "science has undergone a series of dramatic revolutions that have transformed the modern conception of man and his place in the world," end quote. This astounding new story of science, with its surprising plot twists and intriguing characters, unfolds in the coming pages, starting with an interview that rewrites the books that first led me to atheism. So we're going to explore these concepts together, and then when we explore these concepts together, hopefully we can see the evidence that Lee Strobel is talking about. I would love to get questions from you guys, comments, concerns. Feel free, if you agree, disagree, whatever, feel free to leave comments on these videos. And definitely share this with your friends, especially your atheist friends, so that they too can be freed indeed. God bless.